The 10 Deadly Sins, America's Betrayals of Poland, 1939 to 2026. Recently on this channel, I argued that Russia should not continue down the road it has chosen, the road of imperialism, because that road will lead nowhere good, either for Russia itself or for its neighbors. I laid out 10 crimes Russia has committed over the course of history. Some of you may have wondered whether I reserve that kind of scrutiny only for Russia. I do not. If I want to be objective, then I have to apply the same standard to every country, including countries that could have helped Poland and decided not to, or that helped us until their own political interests pointed in a different direction. My purpose is not to attack nations for the sake of it. It is to present the Polish perspective on the decisions that shaped our history. So the next country is, naturally, our close ally today, the United States of America. And here too, when we look at the historical record, especially the last 100 years, the relationship has not always been quite as rosy as we sometimes like to imagine. February 1945. The Livadia Palace on the Crimean coast. 3 men are redrawing the map of Europe for the next 50 years. There's not a single Pole in the room. The country that was the first to say no to Hitler, the country that lost roughly 1 in 6 of its citizens, proportionally the worst casualty rate of the entire war. The country that broke Enigma and handed it to the British, that flew in the Battle of Britain and took Monte Cassino. That country is the subject of the conversation, not a participant in it. Welcome to OllieKayPolitical. Today, 10 deadly sins committed by the United States against Poland from 1939 to the present day. One disclaimer up front, and I mean it. This is not an anti-American episode. America has been, at moments, an indispensable partner to Poland, and I'll make that case honestly at the end because an argument that only runs one way isn't an argument, it's propaganda. This is about something else. An alliance with a superpower is never an alliance of equals. Washington calculates in interests, not in sentiment. And Poland has paid the bill for misunderstanding that at least a dozen times. Everything here rests on documents, conference minutes, declassified files, court judgments. Where I move into interpretation, I'll say so out loud. Sin 1. The Atlantic Charter, a check that was never going to clear. The 14th of August, 1941. Roosevelt and Churchill announced the Atlantic Charter. Point 2 is unambiguous. No territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned. That September, the Polish government in exile in London formally signs on. Poland took that document literally. That was a category error, and it was Poland's error, let's be fair about it. But the American sin is a different one. Washington never publicly walked it back. Nobody said, look, that was a wartime declaration for public consumption. Don't build a national strategy on it. Instead, they let an entire political class in exile stake its survival on a promise already being quietly renegotiated with Stalin. That's the pattern you'll hear 10 times in this episode. Beautiful language outside, hard arithmetic inside. And in between, an ally who has no idea what game he's actually playing. Sin 2. Katyn, the crime Washington filed away, 1943 to 1952. Spring 1940. The Soviet secret police execute roughly 22,000 Polish officers, police officials, professors, and priests at Katyn and other sites, the deliberate decapitation of a nation's leadership class. May 1943. The Germans fly a group of Allied prisoners of war to the graves, including 2 Americans, Lieutenant Colonel John Van Vliet and Captain Donald Stewart. Both go convinced it's Nazi propaganda. Both come back convinced of something else. The documents on the bodies stop in the spring of 1940, long before any German soldier reached that forest. Here's the part that only became public on the 10th of September 2012, when the U.S. National Archives declassified around 1,000 pages. Van Vliet and Stewart sent encoded messages from captivity to U.S. military intelligence, pointing at Soviet responsibility. So the Roosevelt administration had the information from its officers, not from Goebbels, not from the Poles, and it buried it. The report Van Vliet wrote in 1945 vanished from the files, under circumstances nobody has ever explained. In 1951 and 1952, a congressional committee chaired by Ray Madden concluded that Soviet guilt was beyond doubt. The Roosevelt administration had suppressed public knowledge of the crime, and the case should go before an international tribunal. Nothing whatsoever was done with that recommendation. Was it deliberate? Yes. The stated justification was military necessity. Don't provoke Stalin while the Red Army is pinning down the Wehrmacht. You can understand that strategically. You cannot call it honest treatment of an ally. Sin 3. Tehran. Poland partitioned behind Poland's back. December 1943. The Tehran Conference, from the 28th of November to the 1st of December 1943. Churchill lays out 3 matchsticks on a table to demonstrate the future Poland, shifted bodily westward. The eastern border goes to the Curzon line. This is agreed without consulting the legal Polish government, which is, formally, an ally of all 3 powers in the room. But the bitterest moment is a private exchange between Roosevelt and Stalin. The president explains that he personally has no objection to the Soviet border demands, but that he cannot say so publicly, because there are 6 or 7 million Americans of Polish descent, and 1944 is an election year. Sit with that for a second. The borders of an allied nation are settled with the dictator who invaded it in September 1939, and the only break on the American side is the electoral calendar in Chicago and Detroit. Not a principle, not a treaty obligation, a calendar. Tehran, not Yalta, is where Poland's fate was actually decided. Yalta was the notarization. Sin 4. Yalta, the cardinal sin. February 1945. From the 4th to the 11th of February 1945. The terms? The eastern border on the Curzon line with minor adjustments. Compensation in the west, to be determined later. And the government, this is the heart of it, is not the legal Polish government in London. It's the Soviet-installed Lublin Committee, to be reorganized on a broader democratic basis by adding a few outsiders. On top of that, the Declaration on Liberated Europe, promising free elections. A beautiful document, with not one enforcement mechanism attached. No inspections, no sanctions, no deadline. Stalin had the Red Army and the NKVD on the ground. Roosevelt had a piece of paper and a personal conviction that he could handle Uncle Joe. Understand the asymmetry. In February 1945, Poland had close to 600,000 men under arms on the Allied side, and the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. In Livadia, all of it together, carried a weight of exactly 0, because the only currency that counted was whose tanks were physically standing on the ground. The standard defense of Roosevelt? The Red Army was already on the Vistula. The Americans could do nothing short of war with the USSR, and they needed Stalin against Japan. That's a serious argument, and I won't pretend otherwise. But it explains the outcome. It does not explain the conduct. Nobody forced Washington to call this a victory for freedom, or to put its signature to Soviet domination 3 years after guaranteeing self-determination. They could have told the truth. We don't have the power to protect you. They said something else. That gap is the sin. Sin 5. Withdrawing recognition and the silence after 1947. On the 5th of July, 1945, the United States and Britain withdraw recognition from the Polish government in London and recognize the Soviet-sponsored government in Warsaw. With one stroke of a pen, the legal authorities of a state that fought from the first day of the war to the last became a group of private emigrants, with nowhere to go home to, and now no standing either. Then comes the 19th of January, 1947. Parliamentary elections, rigged almost ostentatiously, accompanied by terror against Stanislav Mikolajczyk's Peasant Party, the last real opposition. Washington sent a formal note of protest citing the Yalta commitments. That was the end of it. The note went in a drawer. Business continued. Mikolajczyk himself, the man who had returned to Poland trusting the great power's guarantees, fled that October, hidden in the boot of a car, in fear for his life. A year later, the Marshall Plan launches, and Poland cannot join because Moscow forbids it. The American economic umbrella stops precisely on the line drawn at Tehran. Sin 6. Liberation rhetoric with nothing behind it. The 1952 presidential campaign. John Foster Dulles announces the doctrine of rollback. No more merely containing communism, it's time to liberate the captive nations. Radio Free Europe broadcasts into Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The message is unmistakable. You are not alone. The West has not abandoned you. Hold on. June 1956. Poznan. Polish factory workers strike over wages. It becomes an anti-regime uprising. The army fires on crowds. Dozens die, including a 13-year-old boy, Romek Strzałkowski, whose bloodied flag became the image of the day. October 1956. Budapest. The Hungarians rise, counting on the help they had heard promised on the radio. No help comes. None. Washington, correctly from the standpoint of avoiding a nuclear war, and let's be honest about that, had no intention of fighting over Central Europe. Poland's own October ended differently from Budapest. Władysław Gomułka negotiated limited autonomy directly with Khrushchev and avoided invasion. But that wasn't Washington's doing. It was a calculation on the Warsaw-Moscow axis in which the American voice played no real part at all. The sin isn't that the Americans didn't intervene. It's that for 4 years they had been selling a hope they had no intention of honoring. People died believing someone was coming. Nobody was coming. That is the price of campaign slogans broadcast into countries under occupation. Sin 7. The Sonnenfeldt Doctrine, and Ford's No Soviet Domination. December 1975. Helmut Sonnenfeldt, State Department counselor and a close Kissinger associate, tells a closed meeting of American ambassadors in London that U.S. policy should aim at a more organic relationship between the USSR and the states of Eastern Europe. It leaks in March 1976 via the columnists Evans and Novak. The State Department disputes the precise wording, but the direction is legible. The stability of the Soviet Empire is an American interest, because turbulence inside the bloc risks war. Put plainly, 30 years after Yalta, Washington isn't merely accepting the division of Europe, it's beginning to treat it as an asset worth protecting. The cherry on top arrives in the presidential debate of the 6th of October 1976, when Gerald Ford declares there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. It cost him votes among Polish Americans, but gaffes are at least sincere. An honest counterpoint, though, this is the same era that produced the Helsinki Final Act and its third basket of human rights commitments, a lever that Polish dissidents used relentlessly for the next decade. History is rarely one color. Sin 8. Martial law. The warning that was never passed on. 1981. Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski spent 9 years passing Warsaw Pact documents to the CIA, including the plans for imposing martial law in Poland. In November 1981, he and his family were exfiltrated. On the 13th of December, General Jaruzelski declared martial law, interning around 10,000 Solidarity activists overnight and freezing the largest independent mass movement in the communist bloc. The question that still divides historians: what did Washington do with that knowledge? Solidarity's leadership received no warning. The American case is familiar: protect the source, uncertainty about timing, fear of disinformation. The counter case is equally simple: 10,000 internments and a decade of lost time. Flagging this clearly, this is interpretation, not established fact. There is no document in which someone decides, we don't warn the Poles. There is only the fact that they weren't warned. And in fairness, the Reagan administration responded with sanctions on Warsaw and Moscow, funded the underground for years, and spoke about Poland more forcefully than any administration before it. Those same sanctions also hit an economy ordinary people had to live in. Both things are true at once. Sin 9. The second-class ally. Poland joins the invasion of Iraq as one of Washington's closest partners, commands an entire multinational division in the center-south of the country, and deploys thousands of troops. More than 20 don't come home. The weapons of mass destruction are never found, and the reconstruction contracts Warsaw had been quietly led to expect largely go elsewhere. In parallel, between 2002 and 2003, the CIA operates a black site at Stare Kiekuty in northeastern Poland. On the 24th of July 2014, the European Court of Human Rights rules in Al-Nashiri versus Poland and Hussein versus Poland that Poland violated the convention and must pay damages. The legal, financial, and reputational bills are all paid in Warsaw. Washington pays nothing and confirms nothing. And the reward for that loyalty? Poles kept queuing outside the U.S. Embassy for tourist visas for 16 years after Iraq and 20 years after joining NATO. Poland only entered the visa waiver program on the 11th of November 2019. Countries that sent nobody to Iraq had been in it for years. This isn't wounded pride over a formality. The visa was a message transmitted to millions of people for 2 decades. You are an ally we trust enough to die in Iraq, but not enough to fly to Chicago without a fee and an interview. Congress blocked it for years over refusal rate statistics, an argument that was technically valid, entirely legal, and politically death. Add to the tab May 2012, and President Obama referring to a Polish death camp at the ceremony posthumously awarding the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Jan Karski, the man who tried to tell Roosevelt what was happening in those camps. It's hard to imagine a worse setting. Sin 10. Dealing Over Our Heads, the 21st Century Edition, 2009 to 2026. On the 17th of September, 2009, the Obama administration announces it is scrapping the Bush-era missile defense installations planned for Poland and the Czech Republic. The date is the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland. Coincidence, but a coincidence Warsaw has not forgotten. It was announced as part of the reset with Russia, against which Central European elder statesmen, including Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel, had published an open letter of warning barely 2 months earlier. 2021. The Biden administration waives sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 company and cuts a deal with Berlin over the pipeline, against the explicit joint objections of Poland and Ukraine. And then, 2025. In November, a 28-point American peace plan for Ukraine leaks, negotiated by Steve Witkoff and the Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev, without the European Union, without Poland, and to a large extent, without Ukraine itself. In December, a new U.S. national security strategy sets out the goal of restoring strategic equilibrium with Russia in Europe. 2026. The Pentagon cancels a planned rotation of roughly 4,000 troops to Europe. The president then announces 5,000 additional ones. The net figure remains unclear. In June, Poland formally requests a permanent American base. Washington responds warmly. Congress is supportive on a bipartisan basis, and no binding decision exists. Before anyone writes in the comments that I am overreaching, I am not saying 2026 is Yalta. Poland is in NATO, with Article 5, a serious army, and the highest defense spending relative to GDP in the alliance. What I'm saying is that the mechanism is identical. Two powers sit down to settle the disposition of our region, and the states of that region find out from a press leak. Same logic, different scenery. Counterpoint. Because without this, it's just propaganda. I have to give you the other side, or this episode is worth no more than the agitprop it would resemble. It was the United States that drove NATO enlargement through in 1999, against the warnings of half its own foreign policy establishment. It was Washington that backed the reduction of Poland's crushing debt in the early 90s, and underwrote the fund that stabilized the currency during shock therapy. It is American hardware, Patriots, Abrams, HIMARS, and F-35s, that forms the spine of Poland's rearmament, and American logistics that kept the supply bridge to Ukraine running across Polish territory after February 2022. The Redzikowo missile defense site was eventually built and declared operational, and Radio Free Europe, for all my criticism of 1956, was for 40 years the only window onto the truth that millions of Poles had. The American balance sheet with Poland is not negative. It is cynical, and those are not the same thing. The conclusion here isn't America is the enemy. It's something far less dramatic and far more useful. Great powers do not have friends. They have interests. And it is our job to make the Polish interest profitable for Washington to defend. Every time Poland relied on goodwill, sentiment, or gratitude, it got a bill. Every time Poland had something hard to offer, geography, an army, bases, a defense budget above 4% of GDP, it got taken seriously. That's not a cynical lesson. That's just the lesson. One last thing. All 10 of these stories share a denominator: information. Katyn, Tehran, Yalta, martial law, the peace plan of 2025. Every time, the decisive knowledge sat somewhere other than the decision, and Poland found out last. Sovereignty in the 21st century is largely a question of whether you're in the room where the conversation happens, or whether you get the readout afterwards. If this was worth your time, subscribe. And tell me in the comments which of the 10 I treated too gently or too harshly. I read all of them. This has been OllieKayPolitical. See you next time.